works began here through the Stationers Register, following the Statute of Queen Anne 300 years ago. However, proud as we are of our history, the Stationers Company is as contemporary and relevant today as it was at the time of Caxton. 95% of our members come from the underlying trades of the Guild, including an increasing number from digital media in all its forms. Well, the large turnout tonight is undoubtedly because of the reputation of our guest speaker, Dr. Vinton Cerf. But I believe it also shows that the Stationers Company remains fully plugged into the digital debate, whether that be about technology, effective business models, or the ongoing argument around intellectual property. I'm sure Dr. Cerf's talk will aid that discussion. Well, I hope you all enjoy this evening, which is made possible by the kind sponsorship of David Hicks and the Book Trade Charity. So thank you very much indeed, David. And without further ado, I hand over to Court Assistant Ian Bennett, who will act as your Master of Ceremonies for this evening. Thank you.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, when you don't actually communicate as well as you might. Most of what I was going to say has just been said. But I can't tell you very much about the next man without him doing it himself. So you'll be pleased to hear I'm not going to try to emulate the same thing. But the Caxton window is an interesting one because that is something that was installed in 1804 to celebrate printing in the UK. England, really, not in the UK. And tonight, we've got somebody coming of a similar stature in the mind and eyes of many people to talk to you. The internet is phenomenal. Add on the World Wide Web, and it's phenomenally phenomenal. And that's what we're going to explore tonight with Vinton. It's massively exciting for all stationers, because it's opened up a whole new arena. You come, most of you, to my D&D events, and they're full of new ideas, and people with more ideas coming forward. And it all goes back to a series of events in the United States back in the last century. I don't want to say more. All I want to do is to introduce the main purpose of tonight, which is to listen to Vinton Cerf. Vint, over to you.
So this is something we don't have in the United States. So my wife and I have been living here for 6 months. We arrived in mid-June. We will depart back to the United States in mid-December. But in the meantime, we've taken advantage of many different opportunities, including visiting many of the guild halls, but also many of the stately homes and manor houses around England. I must tell you, my wife has a serious case of Downton Abbey disease. This caused us to come to England last summer for a month. We visited 37 stately homes, including Highclere Castle. We were introduced to the Duke and Duchess of Downton is very different from the way the telephone system worked, which was circuit switching, and the wisdom of the time in telecommunications was that circuit switching was the way that you did communications. Somebody dialed a number, and the circuit that got set up between the initiating instrument and the destination, the circuit was dedicated until somebody hung up. And that was how you did communications. Well, in the computing world, computers don't behave the same way. They generate some information, they spit it out somewhere, and then they're busy wanting to talk to somebody else. So setting up the circuit, carrying it down, and everything else was not very efficient. So instead, packet switching was sort of like electronic postcards. You simply put an address from and to address on this little block of digital information. You put some information like you would on a postcard, and you toss it into the system. The system switches the destination, the packet to the destination, and as soon as it has transited a line, another one can use it. So it's a sharing of broadband resources rather than a dedication of narrowband resources. So this was an experiment which was considered crazy by the traditional telecom people, but we did it anyway. We even invited AT&T to be a part of the program. They said, no thanks, it won't work. But we'll be happy to lease you circuits so you can build your stupid network. So we leased the circuits and we built the network. This was the foreknown beginning of a national scale, eventually international scale experiment in packet switching. I was a student at UCLA at the time, that's the we're known there. The first node was installed in September of 1969, the second one in October of 1969, and I wrote the software for the Sigma 7 machine. Now, that machine's in a museum somewhere, and some people think I should be there. So this worked spectacularly well. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you is what a packet switch looked like in 1969. This is the size of a refrigerator. And it was made by a company called Bolt, Baronet & Newman in Cambridge, Massachusetts, not Cambridge, UK. When they delivered it to UCLA, it was delivered encased in very, very heavy metal. And the reason is they knew they were building this for the military, and they also knew it was going into an extremely hostile environment, graduate students and universities. So it was encased in heavy metal. You wouldn't think that anything this big and heavy and clumsy looking would be the beginning of a major revolution, but it was. Here's another example of Black Swan. This is an attempt to use radio for packet switching in the early to mid-1970s. This is a nondescript looking red truck that is filled with electronics equipment and built by SRI International. It used to be Stanford Research Institute, changed its name to SRI International during the period of the Vietnam War, in response to student complaints about Stanford being involved in the military. Now, this nondescript red truck contained in it packet radios that were about a cubic foot in size, cost $50,000 each. Those are the white things that you see in the middle there. Once again, this is an extremely advanced use of radio. We were using, for some of you who know this stuff, spread spectrum technology. In the mid-1970s, this was really advanced stuff. It took a lot of electronics in order to do that, but it allowed common bandwidth to be shared by multiple transmitters at the same time. We would separate the transmitters by their spread spectrum encoding. Now, our intent was to, first of all, demonstrate packet switching in a mobile radio environment. Today, you carry around these things in your pocket that don't count. They cost $50,000, and yet they are many, many times faster. These were running at 100 kilobits a second. Today, you're running in megabits in many cases, or at least hundreds of thousands of bits a second. But to make matters even more interesting, we were experimenting in the mid-1970s with packetized voice. Today, any of you who use Google Talk or Skype or any of the other, Google Hangouts and so on, are using packetized communication to carry both voice and video. We were doing both in the mid-1970s. Again, these are to the leading edge of what we today would consider a black swan because of the transformation of cost and capacity and facility that these new technologies bring us. Here we were doing not very much of it because the bandwidths available to us in the radio environment were 100 kilobits a second, and in the dedicated wireline that we leased circuits from AT&T for was 50 kilobits a second. And those of you who know that a typical digitized voice channel are 64 kilobits per second, you can't jam very many 64 kilobit circuits in a 50 kilobit channel. So we actually had to use voice compression techniques in order to do the test with the mobile packet voice. We modeled the radio, or modeled the, you you would send 10 parameters, which would be the radii of the various cylinders that was modeling the voice back, to the other side, and then the other side would invert that compression scheme. It produced a relatively low quality voice. I mean, we're down at 1800 bits per second. And when you compress from 64 kilobits down to 1800 bits a second, you would expect to lose a certain amount of quality. The result was that anyone who talked through the system sounded like a drunken Norwegian. By this time, I'm running the Internet Research Program, and I want to demonstrate this to a bunch of journalists, and I'm thinking, how am I going to do this? And then I remembered that one of the participants in the packetized voice program was working for the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. So we got Ingvar to come, and he spoke through the voice system, Model 1, and then he spoke through the packetized voice system that sounded exactly. We didn't tell the generals that everybody would sound. So again, I want to point out two things. First of all, when you start exploring new technologies, you begin to create the conditions under which black swan-like events can occur. And the second thing is, sometimes it takes a long time for this stuff to actually happen in fact. So we're talking here in the mid-1970s, on the order of 35 to 40 years ago. And now, of course, many of these technologies are commonplace. Here's another example. The first time we were able to test 3 networks, each of different character, linked together using the TCP/IP protocols, was November 22nd, 1977, just literally an anniversary a few days ago. I guess that's 36 years ago, if you think about it. We had the packet radio network running in the San Francisco Bay Area. We had the ARPANET, which stretched by this time across the United States and over an internal satellite hop down to Norway and to the UC London. So something also I think many of you may not know is the University College London was absolutely key to the long-range experiments of the implementation of TCP/IP. Professor Peter Kirstein's group at UCL implemented the first TCP/IP on UK soil. My team at Stanford University did our version of it, and we were communicating with each other around 1975 over this internal satellite output. So by 1977, we had a packet satellite network running over the Atlantic using Intelsat 4A and linking both the western part of Europe to the eastern part of the US. So we configured gateways between the networks so that traffic would go from the mobile packet radio band through the mobile packet radio net into the ARPANET, all the way across the ARPANET to Norway and down to UC London, through another gateway into the packet satellite network, back down to the east coast of the US to a ground station there, into another gateway, back into the ARPANET, all the way across the net, down to Los Angeles to USC Information Sciences Institute in Marina del Rey. Now, the distance between San Francisco and Los Angeles is about 400 miles, but the packets traveled about 100,000 miles because they went up and down on 2 satellite hops back and forth across the United States twice and the Atlantic Ocean. And amazingly, it worked. The packets actually arrived at the destination. I remember leaping around saying, it works, as if it couldn't possibly work. It's software, right? It's a miracle when software works. So this was an exciting moment for me because it's the first time we demonstrated that this standardized set of protocols would allow these very different packet switch networks running at different speeds, different delays, different error rates, different packet sizes to communicate in a uniform way. It was the beginning demonstration that an arbitrarily large number of networks could be linked together using this technology. This is what the internet looks like today. If you're looking at it from the standpoint of a global router, which is seeing the global routing tables for moving traffic all the way around the world, the colors are different networks. There are 500,000 plus networks that make up the internet. And what's interesting about this is that there is no central control. Each of the networks is operating independently of the others. They have very different business models. Some are government networks, some are commercial networks, some are not-for-profit networks, some are operated by universities. Some of them are small size, Wi-Fi kinds of networks, with Starbucks. Others are global, gigantic backbones, and everything in between. Everybody uses the protocols voluntarily. No one's forced to do this. They choose their hardware and their software. They decide who to connect to for whatever reasons that motivate them. It's an entirely collaborative was an intergovernmental meeting initially, and they convened in Geneva, and they said, or Tunisia actually, and they said, what's an information society? And everybody looked around at everybody else, and somebody said, well, maybe the internet is kind of like what an information society would be like. And so immediately the bureaucrat said, well, who's in charge of the internet? And we said, well, nobody actually is a fully distributed system, and they wouldn't believe us. They said nothing on that scale could possibly work without central control. Then they looked around some more and they discovered the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which is responsible for allocating IP address space and domain names at the top level of both systems out to regional internet registries and to top level domain managers. And they decided, because it was centrally situated in that part of the function of the internet, that it must be in control of the internet. Then they noticed it had a contract with the U.S. Department of Commerce. That meant that the Department of Commerce must be in control of the internet. Therefore, the U.S. is in control of the internet. And it led to a great deal of consternation. We tried to explain to them that the U.S. government had very, very little control over the internet. This is notwithstanding what we discovered from Mr. Snowden about the USA. Many years later. So the point I want to make here is that this is a very good example of the black swan phenomenon. It starts out small. It starts out as a research project. It starts out not even clear that it's going to work. And the situation was such that it was open so that anyone who wanted to build a piece of this thing was free to do so. Anyone who wanted to connect to anyone else was free to do so for whatever reasons motivated them. When you unleash that kind of architecture and you allow it to become part of a commercial environment, the motivations for building it become quite strong. And so you see this very rapid growth. Starting in 1980, we turned it on in 1983. It was officially turned on after 10 years of development. By 1988, commercial services were beginning to show up, at least in the United States. And if you were to plot the size of the internet based on the number of networks, number of computers, and number of users, it was growing at 100% per year, every year, for at least 10 years, from 1988 to 1998. And that led us to the middle of the dot boom, which turned into the dot bust of April 2000. But the system has continued to grow, not at 100% a year. But this is one of the phenomena of black swans, is that it has an escalating and potentially exponential character to it. And it doesn't look that way at the beginning. Exponential systems look kind of weak and thin, and you don't recognize them as exponential until they get to the point where they hit the knee of the curve. Those of you who know a little bit about tsunamis know that they go at 1,000 miles an hour along the surface of the water, 2 or 3 inches high. It's a lot of water moving really fast. You can't see it until it gets to the shore, which goes, at an angle, and all this water piles up and it can't get out of its own way, so it turns into a giant tsunami. That's what's going on with some black swan phenomena. Here's another little bit of statistics. In the middle of 2013, we estimated about 1 billion devices on the internet with their own domain names and fixed IP addresses. That doesn't count the things that are dynamically connected, like laptops and desktops and mobiles and things like that. Those things number in the billions. Cisco estimated there might be as many as 9 billion devices capable of being on the net, although not all of them may be there all at the same time. That's a big number, and it's sort of amazing in a way, because the internet address space only accounted for 4.3 billion terminations. When Bob Kahn and I started to work in 1973, we actually asked ourselves, okay, so how many termination points should we have on this experimental network? And we went through a little exercise, imagining maybe this would get big someday, and we said, okay, let's see, how many networks will there be per country? Well, we just finished building the ARPANET, which is not exactly an inexpensive proposition, so we thought, well, maybe there'll be 2 per country, nationwide size, and so there'll be some competition. Then we said, how many countries are there? And we didn't know when there was no Google to ask. So we guessed at 128, because that's the power of 2. And so that meant 256 networks on a global scale. And we said, how many computers will there be on the networks? And remember, we were asking this question in 1973, when computers were large machines that didn't move anywhere, and they were time-shared, and they served, tens of thousands of users. So we thought, okay, go for it. How about 16 million machines per network? That's 24 bits. bits, 24 bits for the machines and 8 bits for a number of networks. And so there was born the 32-bit address space of the internet. And that actually lasted until 2011. We ran out in 2011. But fortunately, we had all become terrified that we were going to run out. So by 1996 or so, we were already developing IP version 6. You're using IP version 4 for the most part, which is a 1978 product. The 1996 design was IP version 6 and had 128 bits of address space. If you do the math, that's 340 trillion addresses. 3.4 times 10 to the 38. This is a number only the Parliament would appreciate. But the whole point here is that the production version of the internet is IP version 6. This was turned on officially and formally on June 6, 2012. So the 21st century internet is IP version 6. I have a favor to ask all of you. The IP version 6 implementations by the ISPs has been very, very sluggish. It should have started in the mid-1990s, and it has been very slow. Will you please ask your ISP, it might be BT, it might be somebody else, when will they deliver IPv6 to you? What's the schedule and what's the plan? And ask for a date and a system. That will help get the message to them that users care. Most of them are saying, no users are asking about IPv6. Well, of course not. Most people don't even know what it is. And they're not even supposed to know. They're supposed to hide that. And the ISPs are supposed to make it transparent and run both protocols at the same time. So you can help me beat the goal ahead. I'm looking for ways of publicly embarrassing the ISPs that haven't implemented IPv6 yet. In terms of the number of users, it's estimated now there are about 3 billion on the planet. Now, this is a big deal for me. My title in the movie was Chief Internet Evangelist. And what this means is I want to get more internet built so everybody can access it. With 7 billion people in the world, I have 4 billion people to convert, so I can use some help. So keep that in mind. Finally, mobiles are suddenly another very interesting phenomenon, another black swan in some respects. 7 billion of them in use. Many people have more than one, so that means that not everyone on the planet has it yet. But here's another coincidence for you. Internet begins design in 1973. It's turned on in 1983. Earlier this year, I had the pleasure of giving a man named Marty Cooper the Marconi Award for his contribution to the design of a handheld mobile phone at Motorola. The year he did the design was 1973. The year he turned it on was 1983. And we didn't know anything about each other in that 10-year period at all. But I had, by good fortune, a friend who is a very rapid adopter of all technology. He called me in 1983 and he said, I have something to show you, come to lunch. So I came to lunch. And I found sitting on the lunch table a thing that was about this big with a whip antenna sticking out. What's that? He said, it's a mobile phone. He said, well, don't those require all that equipment in the back of the car? He said, no, it's a handheld mobile phone. I said, well, how does it work? I asked him a bunch of questions and finally he said, look, I don't know the answer to all that. Why don't you call the guy that invented it? So I called Marty Cooper on the mobile phone and asked him about it. So we have tracked each other unexpectedly, and now you can clearly see there's been a powerful convergence of those two technologies. The thing that makes this, again, another black swan phenomenon is the hypergolic nature of the combination. The mobile phone is a platform. It's a programmable platform. It's very powerful all by itself. But it does something else. Because it's connected to the internet, it has access to all of the content, processing power, and information of the internet. The applications that run on the mobile phone are often taking advantage of the processing power and information of the rest of the internet. And on the other side, the internet benefits from the mobile phones because now it is accessible to you wherever you are, assuming you have access to a base station and suitable capacity. So these two things mutually reinforce each other. It's another interesting phenomenon in the world of black swans. Whoops, that was interesting. Now for our next trick, ladies and gentlemen. There. Now, internet is not static. And this is something I have to keep convincing, especially young people about, because they think, well, the thing's been around for 40 years, been in operation since 83, and it's just sort of there. Who could possibly do anything with it? The honest answer is it has been evolving and adapting over time. Now let me see if I can outline for you one aspect of internet design that leads to assume that somehow they will move from their injection point to the destination. This is not any different than what you and I do with postcards. We put a to address on the postcard, we put a from address on it, we write some content on it, and we stick it in the mailbox. And we assume somehow it's going to get delivered, but the postcard has no idea whether it went on somebody's backpack, on a bicycle, on a car, or a truck, or an airplane, or a boat. It doesn't know, and it doesn't care. The sender assumes that somehow or other the postal services of the world will figure out how to get connected, how to get it delivered. So that's a very important point about internet packets. They don't know how they're being carried, and they don't care. The consequence of that is that every communications technology that's been invented since 1973 has been swept into the internet because we can put packets on top of it. And so this has allowed the network to continually adapt to and absorb new technologies for transport. The second thing is that the internet packets don't know what they're carrying. All they know is they're carrying a bag of bits, just like a postcard doesn't know what it has written on it. The consequence of that design choice is that the network doesn't know what the applications are, and it doesn't care. The applications are a consequence of interpreting bits at the edges of the net where the computers are. So when you want to invent a new application, you have to do something at the edges of the net, but you don't have to do anything to the network itself. Now, I'm being a little bit facetious about this because if your application requires a lot of bandwidth, like YouTube, for example, you really need a network that has a lot of bandwidth. And at the beginning, we didn't have a lot of bandwidth. So some of the applications that you see today weren't really feasible in terms of capacity 20 or 30 years ago. But that's all it took. All it took was new technologies for transport that kept running at higher and higher speeds. So the 50 kilobit internet of 1973 is now the 50 gigabit internet of 2013. And we continue to see increased capacity in all directions, both radio and optical. So I just want to emphasize that the internet continues to evolve. I've already mentioned IPv6. This is a major introduction of a new capability, literally just a year ago. Internationalized domain names. We all type domain names using Latin characters, but we've now made it possible to use Cyrillic and Korean and Chinese and Japanese and so on, Arabic and Hebrew and so forth, for domain names. And so now there are 2,000 applications for new generic top-level domains that have been received a year or more ago at ICANN. And they're being processed, and some of them are non-Latin character domains which have already been injected into the top-level root zone. So we're seeing that kind of adaptation and exchange. The next thing is that security is a big issue for a lot of different reasons. When the network was originally designed, it wasn't even clear if it was going to work. And so we didn't pay a huge amount of attention to securing it as much as we paid attention to making it work. But now it occupies an enormous part of our daily lives. Large numbers of people use it. Some of them do not have our best interests at heart. So increasing the security of the network is a very important activity. Now we're using digital signatures to secure the domain name, the binding of domain names and internet addresses in the domain name system. So when you look up a domain name to get the internet address back for it, you can ask for a signed response, which you can check to make sure that the pairing is not altered by somebody who's gotten into the domain name system and tried to change the IP address to vector you to the wrong place. The same thing can be done, not yet being done, for routing. The routing cables essentially respond to people announcing, I'm connected to this part of the net, so if you want to send something to me, please send it in this direction. It's possible to hijack some of the routing cables, and so we're going to stop that from happening by using digital signatures again to validate the announcements about who's connected to whom in the network. Sensor networks are becoming part of the net. I have a little more to say about that in a moment. And in the United States, there's something called the Smart Grid, which is a joint program of the Department of Energy and the Department of Commerce, essentially focused on energy-consuming, electricity-consuming devices, keeping track of how much energy they use and when, so that at the end of the month, the consumer could figure out why is my bill, it's true I had so many thousand kilowatt hours of use, but I don't remember what it was I did to consume that. So we're trying to feed back to people, this is what you did, these are the devices you use, maybe your lifestyle should change in order to reduce your usage of energy and that would reduce the bill. The other thing that these devices are capable of doing is responding to advice that we're reaching a peak load, and so if you don't really need to use electricity right now, please don't. This is called demand response, and that's an opportunity to control the demand for energy. So historically, all you could do with a power generation system was to meet the demand. And when you can't with brownouts and blackouts, you had to generate as much power as was being demanded. If you could tell systems don't use power right now, you could clip the peak loads, and that avoids big capital investment for power generation capacity that you can use very often. Now, this is part of the black swan phenomenon, and it has a great deal to do with the economics of digital versus other media. And this is very relevant in this fall because the economics of paper or other hard copy media are very different from the economics of digital. So when bits don't cost very much to transport by comparison with physical things. And so all of the businesses that rely on the delivery of physical things are affected by this digital phenomenon. In the case of magazines and newspapers in particular, instead of having to have deadlines for printing so that you could then deliver the magazine and the newspaper in a timely way, when the editor says the story is ready to go, bang, it's out the door because all you need to do is put it on a website and it's now accessible to the subscribers. You can even see that Netflix is a company in the US that started out by sending DVDs through the Postal Service. They turned the Postal Service into a high bandwidth, high delay communication system. You know, he was putting something like 2 million DVDs into the Postal Service a day. Now, sometimes it took 3 days for it to get there, so it's a high delay system, but it's very high throughput. He's now, Reed Hastings has now moved off into streaming video, which is what a lot of people are doing now. So this is one big issue because black swan phenomenon sometimes ruin your business model. In the case of newspaper, it used to be the cheapest way of delivering a large amount of information on a consistent basis to an audience. They were all interested in what's new, and because they were delivering this stuff to them, you could also deliver advertising. It was a beautiful, beautiful business model, and it worked really well for quite a long time. But then along comes this online environment. Now you don't have to deliver the same ad to everyone. You can deliver different ads, which is what we do at Google. Classified ads now become an online phenomenon, like Craigslist and so on. So the business models of the newspapers have really taken a hit. It's not just Google or Bing or Microsoft or Amazon or anything else. It's trends in our society to move away from reading physical objects to consuming news in a very different way, whether it's television or radio or online. So the effect of the economics is quite powerful. It caused companies to be forced to either change their business models or die. This is Darwin all over again. You only have 2 choices, adapt or die. And businesses are confronted by the same thing. There's some very interesting things, though, that happen. Again, I'm really delighted we're in the Stationers Hall because I want you to think for just a moment about online presentation of something as simple as text. Now think about the evolution of the book. We start out with scrolls, and then somebody gets an idea for a random access scroll. It's called a codex or a book where you flip through, and you don't have to unroll everything to find something. You flip through it because you cut it up into pages. And we got into the habit of using that structure for identifying where information is. So we had page numbers. We had the notion of paragraph. We could talk about, the 4th page, 3rd paragraph, 2nd sentence to identify a place in this thing called a book. Now let's imagine you've got this online thing. Maybe you're looking at a Kindle, maybe you're looking at an iPad or a Nexus or one of the other soft copy or laptop for that matter. And you change the font size because you don't have to wear your reading glasses. As soon as you do that, the number of pages in the book changes. So suddenly, our reference points in the structure of books are suddenly disrupted dramatically. Once again, black swan phenomenon, small change, that is soft copy, have a massive impact. Or all kinds of practices that we have honed over centuries, we now have to relearn. How about bandwidth? Clearly, it had a big impact on digitized voice and the like. But there's some other interesting things. At Google, we're experimenting, because that's not true. We are building a business around gigabit speed networks. We have been installing and operating a 1 billion bit per second network in Kansas City. Part of the reason for Instead of streaming video, it turns out an hour's worth of video you can download in 10 seconds at a gigabit. So people don't have to stream video anymore. You can download it faster than you can possibly watch it, and then play it back whenever you want to. So suddenly you're no longer a slave to delivering the video exactly at the right time in order to get the audio and the video in sync. So an increase in speed by a factor of 10 or 100 is qualitatively different than a simple incremental increase. And once again, that is the hallmark of black swan phenomena. They have an impact of the qualitative type. Now, the Internet of Things is upon us. More and more devices are going to be part of the Internet. Some of them you've already seen, like picture frames that are able to download images from a web page and then cycle through them. We use this at home. All of us have mobile phones with digital cameras. We take pictures, we upload them to a website, and the family picture frames download from the website, and then everybody can see what's happening to nieces and grandchildren and so on. Now, there is a little security issue here, because if somebody hacks the website, the grandparents may see pictures of what they hope are not the grandchildren. So suddenly security is just as important at home as it is at work. You see internet-enabled refrigerators. I used to wonder, what would you do with an internet-enabled refrigerator? One obvious thing is a nice touch-sensitive display, and you augment the family communication system, which in the US anyway is magnets and paper in the front of the refrigerator. Now you can have websites and blogs and the email and all that sort of thing. But I also thought, if you had a way of putting an RFID chip on everything that's inside the refrigerator, then the refrigerator would know what it has inside. So while you're at work, it can be surfing the net, finding recipes that it can make with what it has inside, and when you get home, you can see recipes and suggestions on the display. And you can extrapolate this. You can imagine being on vacation, and you're going home, and suddenly your mobile goes off. It's the refrigerator telling you that the milk has been in there for 3 weeks and it's not cold. Or maybe you're at the store, at the grocery store, and your pager goes off. It's the mobile again. It's the refrigerator again saying, I have everything I need for spaghetti dinner. Don't forget the marinara sauce. Now, the Japanese have destroyed this idyllic view because they've invented an internet-enabled bathroom scale. And when you get on the scale, it figures out which family member you are, and it sends that information to the doctor's office. Medical record. And that's probably okay, let's face it. However, the refrigerator's on the same network. So you come home and you see diet. Or maybe it just refuses to open because it really doesn't. Now, mobile is somewhere in the middle right there. We all have those, so you know what that phenomenon is about. The guy in the middle is interesting. This is an internet-enabled surfboard. I haven't got it. He's Dutch, I am told. And I imagine he was sitting on the water waiting for the next wave thinking, if I had a laptop on my surfboard, I could be surfing the internet while I'm waiting. So he put a laptop on the surfboard, put a radio, a Wi-Fi service at the rescue shack, and now he sells this as a product. So, if you want to go surfing and you want to surf the net while you're out there in the water, this is the product for you. I used to tell jokes about internet-enabled light bulbs. Someday every light bulb will have its own IP address. Well, I can't tell jokes about that anymore because I received an IP-enabled radio-based LED light bulb recently. It lasts about 15 years. It's an LED, which it doesn't have the same failure rate as either fluorescent or incandescent, and it's controllable remotely by IPv6 radio. So I don't tell jokes about that anymore. You see Sergey Brin there wearing Google Glass, and this I want to say is a really interesting experiment. It is really functionally not too different than essentially strapping your mobile to your forehead, like this. But it's a lot more comfortable to wear. It has a high-speed processor. It has about 16 gigabytes of memory. It has a camera. It has a microphone. And it has a bone conduction speaker. So when you're wearing it, you don't have to occlude your ears so you can hear ambient sound. And no one else can hear what it's saying to you. So the question is, what do we do with this? Well, we have about 6,000 of them in use right now. We intend to expand that during the rest of this year to about 24,000 total. And then next year we expect The deaf guy responds in sign language, and of course the blind guy can't see that, but the camera in the Google Glass sees the sign language, translates it into English, translates the English into German, and then speaks the German through the bone conduction speaker. So now the blind guy hears German, and the deaf guy sees English, and the two are communicating. Now, I would be the first to tell you that we can't actually do all of that, but we can get awfully close. The only part that we really can't do is interpreting sign language. And that's not out of the question. It's an engineering problem, and I predict that we will be able to do that, or someone will be able to do that by the time the end of this decade comes, maybe sooner. So we have lots and lots of these devices. Now, the thing I want to emphasize, and again, the black swan phenomenon, every time these devices interact with each other, it's a kind of experiment, because every one of them has a different software load, and every time you interconnect them, you're connecting things that might never have been connected before. And so there is, in some sense, an opportunity for something unusual to happen every time these interactions occur. This is a little bit like the anthill theory of internet evolution. If you imagine watching 2 or 3 ants in an anthill for the day, probably the 3 that you pick won't do anything very interesting. But if you think there are 1 million ants in the anthill, some of them, some small percentage of them, will discover something really interesting to bring back to the anthill. The internet is like that. There are billions of experiments every single day, and most of them go unnoticed. But every once in a while, something really interesting happens, and there are so many opportunities for these interactions to happen, for people to try out ideas, that every single day something interesting happens in the net. Some of those things can turn out to have a black swan-like effect. Here's another example of the sensor net I have at home. It's an IPv6 radio-based sensor net. It's a commercial product. It's not me in the garage with a soldering net. And these little devices are about the size of a mobile. They run on 2 AA batteries for about a year. They're sampling the temperature and humidity and light level in each room in the house every 5 minutes. They form a mesh network, so it's a store and forward network in addition to being a sensor net. And they deliver this information to a server that's down in the basement in a rack of equipment. So I know only a geek would do this, but the whole idea is that at the end of the year, I have really good engineering information about the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning of the house. Instead of just guessing or having anecdotal results, I know what to do to adjust the system. One room in the house is a wine cellar. This is very important because it needs to be less than 60 degrees and higher than 40% humidity to keep the corks from drying out. So that one's been alarmed. And if the temperature goes above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, I get an alarm on my mobile. This just happened actually a couple of months ago when the cooling system failed and I got an alarm on my mobile saying their wine is warming up. And one time I was away for quite a while, several days, and every 5 minutes for several days I kept getting a moving note saying the wine is getting warmer. So I asked the guys who make this, Archrock, now a subsidiary of Cisco, do you have a remote actuator? And they said yes. And they said, great, does it have strong authentication on it? They said, why? They said, well, there's a 15-year-old next door, and I don't want him messing around with my wine cellar cooling system. So they said, yes, we can strongly authenticate with digital signatures. Who is controlling the system? So we installed that. And then I got to thinking, I can actually tell if someone's gotten into the wine cellar when I'm away, because I can see if the lights went off and on, but I don't know what they did in there. So I thought, okay, so why don't they put RFID chips on every bottle? I can do an instantaneous inventory of all the bottles to see if any have left the wine cellar without my permission. Proudly describing this to one of my engineering friends, and he said to me, you know, there's a bug in your design. I said, what do you mean there's a bug? And he said, well, you could go into the wine cellar and drink the wine and leave the bottle. Okay, so now we have to put sensors in the cork. And if we're going to do that, we might as well sample the esters to figure out what wine is ready to drink. So before you open the bottle, you interrogate the cork. And if that's the bottle that got up to 80 degrees because of a failure in the cooling system, that's the bottle you give to somebody who doesn't know the difference. So this is a very practical thing to have around the house. I believe most offices, most buildings, most residences, and everything else will have systems like this in them and be normal. The buildings will be intelligent. The buildings will be instrumented. They will know if people are present. They'll know how many people are present. They'll know if they're, where they are in the house. That information, which by the way also has a great deal of privacy concerns about it, is also something that allows the house to adapt to the necessary requirement. Now I wanted to show you here because it's so relevant to where we are right now. I want you to think for a minute about the things that you do every day using your computers, laptops, mobiles, pads, and the like. You're often using applications, and sometimes those applications produce fairly complex files. Maybe it's a spreadsheet, maybe it's a text document, maybe it's something else. Those digital files are not meaningful unless you are able to preserve the application that knows what those bits mean. Now let's imagine it's the year 3000, and you've just done a Google search, and you've discovered the 1997 PowerPoint file. Let's imagine you're running Windows 3000, just for the sake of it. The question is Windows 3000 or Windows Office, does it know how to interpret a 1,000-year-old PowerPoint file? And the chances are pretty good it might not be able to do that, and this is not a gratuitous dig at Microsoft. Even if you were using open source software, it's not 100% clear that you can maintain compatibility with open source software for 1,000 years on these older files. So the real question is, how do I preserve the meaning of digital information over time? I've been using the phrase digital vellum, and I do not mean by this the physical medium. Digital vellum, real vellum has the interesting property that you can still read it 1,000 years later because it preserved the image and often the illumination and everything else. In order to achieve the equivalent capability in the digital world, we are going to have to preserve not only the bits, but also the application programs, maybe the operating system that supported those application programs, and maybe even the details of the computers that ran the operating systems. Now, cloud computing, assuming it continues, might be part of the solution to the problem because we use virtual machines. We can emulate older machines if we have the right information. We can run the older operating systems. We can run the older applications and make those bits meaningful again. We have technologies right now for storing digital information that are estimated to last 10 to the 20th years, believe it or not. This is really interesting nanomaterial stuff. That's longer than the likely age of at least our universe. The problem is, will we still be able to read the bits when we need to, and will we be able to make sense of them? There are all kinds of intellectual property issues associated with trying to solve this problem, because if you have an application program, who owns it? What if the company that makes it goes out of business? What if they choose not to support it anymore? Under what grounds of preservation will we be able to get access to that information? What about the operating systems? This is a really complex problem. It is not solved, and it is not getting enough attention. This is something I hope very much to pursue personally, even whether it's within or outside of the Google framework. So that's one point I want to make, especially here where preservation of physical materials has been our friend, but in the long term, digital information needs the same kind of preservation. There are all kinds of technology challenges associated with the network. Again, I'm not going to go through all the details here. Except to say that as the internet continues to evolve, it invents new problems for us to solve, which is true of many technologies. Again, the potentially black swan phenomenon. I do want to finish up with two brief status reports. There is, in fact, an interplanetary internet. It is in operation. It links Earth and Mars, the International Space Station, and the Apophis spacecraft that's in orbit around the Sun. And the program started in 1998 when my colleagues at the Jet Propulsion Lab were celebrating the arrival in 1997 of the Pathfinder project. And we started saying, well, what else is coming? What missions are planned to Mars, and what kind of communication will be available? Up until that time, all the communication tended to be point-to-point radio links. So the Pathfinder communicated from the surface of Mars to Earth to the Deep Space Network. And we got to thinking, what if we have multiple devices on the surface? How will they communicate with each other locally? What if they have to communicate with orbiting satellites locally as opposed to going all the way back to Earth in order to communicate back and forth? We said, we need networks. And we thought, why don't we use TCP/IP? It works on Earth, so it probably ought to work on Mars. And the answer is it probably would work on Mars, but it doesn't work between Earth and Mars. And there's a reason for that. The speed of light is too slow. The distance between Earth and Mars is 35 million miles. It takes 3.5 minutes one way at the speed of light to transmit a signal from Earth to Mars when we're closest together. When we're farthest apart, it's 235 million miles. It takes 20 minutes one way for a signal to get from Earth to Mars. Now, that's 40 minutes round trip time. TCP/IP was So we had to design protocols that were prepared to deal with variable delay and disruption, and that's what DTN is all about. Those protocols are now running on all these various spacecraft, including the Mars Science Lander, which arrived last year. Here's what we hope will happen, is that we've standardized the protocols now. They're available to any of the spacefaring nations. If they start using them as a standard element of their spacecraft, then any spacecraft that's been launched for a scientific purpose can be repurposed when it's finished that primary mission to be a relay in its stored forward interplanetary network. So we imagine this will grow across the solar system in step with the scientific missions that are launched, just like the Internet grew on planet Earth. Now, that's not the end of the story. This is the last slide, by the way, if people are getting nervous. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which sponsored the original Internet work and the ARPANET work and the original interplanetary architecture, sponsored a study to design a spacecraft to get to the nearest star in 100 years. Caris Interstellar is one of the parties that's in the consortium that's doing this study. They're located here in the UK. So here's the problem. Getting to the nearest star would take 65,000 years with today's current propulsion systems. That's a little long even for an ARPA project. So we're going to have to find a higher speed system, something that will get us up to about 20% the speed of light. And ion engines may conceivably fill that bill. Will have to function for 100 years. So you have to have enough mass in order to run those engines for that long. And then at the halfway point, you have to turn around and slow down. Otherwise, it will blast into the Alpha Centauri and get one picture and that's it. So, pretty expensive photograph. The point here is that we believe we have some ways to solve that problem. Then the next problem is navigation. Normally, when you're navigating in interplanetary space, you launch a mission to go in orbit around Mars, for example, and partway through that mission, you will do a mid-course correction by sending signals to the spacecraft telling it what it's supposed to do. Orient yourself this way and it lasts for 10 seconds. Well, imagine you have a spacecraft that's a light year away. It takes a year to tell it to do anything, and it takes another year to find out what happened. This is not exactly interactive. So, in this case, we have enough knowledge about the proper motion of stars within about 10 light years of Earth that we actually could navigate autonomously. We could use stars that are 10,000 or 100,000 light years away to orient ourselves and use that information to help figure out how to get to, in this case, Alpha Centauri. Then the last question is how to communicate over a 4 light year distance. You have to generate a signal that will be detectable over 4 light years. That's a long ways off. So the question is, what kind of signal can you generate? Some of us are favoring what is called a femtosecond laser. This is a laser which let's say it's a 100-watt laser. If you compress 100 watts into 10 to the minus 15 seconds, it's a whopping big signal. And so we believe you can detect that over a distance of 4 light years, except for one problem. Even a laser with beam spread over 4 light years, so that the beam is attenuated, it's about the size of the solar system. Now you know why I need the interplanetary backbone network to build a synthetic aperture receiver in order to reintegrate the signal coming back from Alpha Centauri. That's why I want the interplanetary backbone. Now, one of the physicists in the team said, there is another phenomenon we might be able to harness. What's that? He said, well, you know how gravity bends light? You remember that's how Einstein's theory was demonstrated by looking at an eclipse of the sun and seeing a star appear to move towards the sun because of the bending of light. So it turns out the sun can act as a gravity lens, and it will bend light and collimate it into a focal point, except the focal plane is 550 astronomical units from Earth. That's about 55 billion miles, give or take. The farthest spacecraft